Okay, so this seminar today is a continuation of some seminars that started a couple of months ago. But it's also connected a little bit to this panel discussion that we had with Pablo Garcia from the Central Bank of Chile and Thomas Huleb from the Czech National Bank and David Archer. That was in the Central Bank of Chile annual macro workshop. Okay, so we would like to thank Thomas and Pablo, as well as others like Larry Shembri and other people that have really helped provide guidance about how our thinking is evolving in this way. We've changed the name, partly thanks to a person that's joining us today. So initially, we had floated the idea of the PPAS instead of FPASS. And anyway, there was somebody that convinced us that we should probably just go from FPASS Mark 1 to FPASS Mark 2. So that's where we are today. Let's hope it doesn't change again, and we can maybe lock down. So I have a number of people from central banks. We have Mika Kortelainen from the Central Bank of Finland. We have Naafey and Z, and I'm going to call him Z. I worked with him for the last month or so, and it's just wonderful to see this team of Z, who's a very seasoned person that understands Pakistan very well, and Naafey, a fairly recent graduate from school and stuff. And so it's really fun. I have both of them here today to talk a little bit about their experiences in Pakistan, as well as Armen, Nurbekyan. Him and I go back a long ways, and it's a pleasure to have him here. And Shalva. I don't see Shalva. I don't know what he's just not appearing in my display right now. Okay, good. So what we're going to do here, we're going to start off with we have a little bit of fun, hopefully. We're going to start off with this quote from Stan Fisher that he had in a speech that he did. He was doing some reflecting on past monetary policy and so on, where he said, "I'd rather have Bob Solow than an econometric model, but I'd rather have Bob Solow with an econometric model than without him." And I think this is a really kind of a neat way of thinking about a number of issues in terms of what we're doing in central banks, in particular when we're developing the forecasting and policy analysis systems to support forward-looking monetary policies. So I want to have a little bit of fun here. I also want to give a little plug to my favorite piece of software. And my favorite piece of software is so you can see my screen right now, I guess. And the software is called Desmos. It's like a graphic calculator. So I never had a graphic calculator when I was a kid. So it was like an old kid fighting a graphic calculator. And I use it for a lot of stuff. I use it, for example, for playing around with my granddaughter. She's 3 years old, and we play Phrase, the Princess of the Rainbow and stuff like that. But what I'm going to use it for today is actually to think about central banks. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to just show you how to think about the history of monetary policy and developing these frameworks and so on. And so New Zealand did it, but they did it without having like an analytical framework at all, okay? And so the way I want to think about this is on the vertical axis, we're going to have Bob Solos. So Stan Fisher said, I prefer to have Bob Solo than an econometric model. And on the horizontal axis, we're going to think of a macro modeling toolbox. But in this toolbox, I want you to think of everything. Things for nowcasting, things for near-term forecasting, structural models, DSG models, absolutely everything is in this toolkit. In principle, you have to develop them, okay? And so when you think of New Zealand, first adopting inflation targeting without any analytical capabilities whatsoever, one way to think about it in terms of Stan's point is that they don't have any Bob Solos and they don't have any macro toolbox. And so you're doing monetary policy without any human capital, without any macro tools that are up to the task for doing Bob Solo. So sometimes people would actually try to develop models without Bob Solo. That didn't work out so well. And so New Zealand tried that, and it didn't work out. And so the very first thing that they recognize is that they need to have Bob Solo. So we go up the vertical axis, we've got some human capital inside the institution that understands things like flexible exchange rates and nominal rigidities and everything else. Now, in this discussion today, okay, I want to think of the Bob Solo as a composite character, because most central banks cannot afford to have even one Bob Solo. And so the range of skills that Bob Solo performs is a combination of all the different kinds of skills that we need if we're going to implement these forward-looking frameworks and so on. And so the idea of nowcasting and current analysis and near-term forecasting, as well as doing all the analytical support for doing things like median projections and so on, right? So the way to think about it, they realize at some point that it's really all about capital, and in which case we move up. And then at that point, they realize that there's a trade-off. There's a trade-off between how much they invest in human capital and how much they invest in developing that macro toolbox. Okay, so my first question to the panel, with that framework in mind, how many Bob Solos do we need to run monetary policy? Okay, so that's going to be my opening question for the panel. And how do we think about these Bob Solos in terms of the types of resources that we need to implement IFPASS Mark II, which David is going to talk about right now. Okay, so David, I'm going to turn the presentation over to you, and you can tell us about IFPASS Mark II. Oh, we can't hear you.
Well, that will be because I was muted. That's a good explanation for not being heard. Okay, I'm going to talk about the evolution of IFPASS from the realization that one needs one in the first place, which came pretty early on in New Zealand after implementing inflation targeting. We realized we needed to process policy problem. And that essentially is what IFPASS is about. It's about processing the policy problem. It's why we want an IFPASS. I'll talk about the key place that macro modeling has in that, but I'll also talk about the process of combining macro modeling with Bob Solow, with the decision maker, because it's important to understand the circular nature of that process, which is especially important when we come on to talk about the evolution from Mark 1 to Mark 2 versions of IFPASS. So what is IFPASS? It's a structured system for analyzing the central bank decision maker's policy problem. Now I'm going to keep on using these words, the policy problem that the decision maker has to process. So the policymaker needs some kind of assistance. So we have an IFPASS which is designed to help the policymaker understand how their policy instruments are going to need to evolve to meet their objectives, given various economic scenarios, various configurations of economic conditions and shocks and process changes. This system is going to end up generating forward paths for the instruments. And those forward paths are going to play two roles. Firstly, they're going to become the center of the discussion amongst the policy makers as to how to understand the implications of having these objectives in this kind of circumstance that they're facing, or sets of circumstances that they might be considering. And it's going to become important as part of the policy communication. So the essence of the IFPASS, a structured system to help understand where policy needs to go, better than waving your hands, guesswork, using what you've learned to form instincts. And it's going to become the center of discussions inside the Monetary Policy Committee and the center of monetary policy communications. So the first of these was built in Canada, but used first actively in New Zealand, started back in 1997. Now, what is the policy problem that I keep talking about? It is how to set instruments to meet objectives. Now, we've got to recognize that policy has got lags, and there's feedbacks from policy choices through expectations and through credibility. And this already there's a complex problem to process, but these lags, these feedback mechanisms just make the policy problem too complex to process mentally. You need to do something more analytical with it, which gives us a key place for macro models, because macro models are the things which help us work through what are the quantitative implications for the policy instruments of these problems that we need to solve, these how to achieve these objectives we've been given. The macro models are going to require tuning to the current situation, and they're going to require adaptation to be able to address the current policy questions. And you'll see these things coming back in my description of the process, the circular process, which is at work. It means the existence of the macro models also means a need for a close dialogue with the decision makers so that the modelers are understanding what the nature of the questions that need to be thought about are. And it's going to need close dialogue with the data analysts, because the data analysts need to be able to let the modelers know what's the detailed data saying. So the role of macro modeling flows directly from the complexity of the problem. But models, even suites of models, while they can handle complexity better than even Bob Solow's human brain, they don't know the starting points. They're only treating subsets of the economic dynamics that are going to be relevant. There are many things we don't think about until they become relevant, and then we need to think about how to incorporate those dynamics. And they only build in an approximation of the policy response. Even if you have even if you're clever enough, which you should be, to move towards building in a loss function into the structure, you're still going to be short of having a full understanding of the risk characteristics of the policy problem. But in many cases, only a policy reaction function is used, which is even further away from the kind of policy response that will be adopted by the policymakers. So macro models have a key role, but only in conjunction with the decision makers, who have to tell you what the current questions in their mind are. They have to reflect on whether the model is they're building in a reasonable approximation of policy or something which is very inconsistent with policymakers' preferences. And in conjunction with data analysts, who are going to tell you what starting point to assume, what shocks might be working through the system, what they can see in the data about the character of the shocks, and what they can see in the way the data is coming in as to what economic dynamics might be in play that are not embedded in the structure yet. Now, this produces a circular process. There are 5 steps in the circular process. And you can start, because it's circular, you can start anywhere in describing the steps. But I'm going to start at the point where the decision makers identify in the course of discussion with staff and among themselves what their policy concerns are, what they're worried about, what they think they need to understand better in order to have a good policy decision. They're going to be helped in this by data analysis, they're going to be helped in this by model simulations, but they're going to end up identifying their policy concerns. And for simplicity, for tractability, it'll only be a small number of the most relevant concerns that they will identify. There's going to be data analysis as the second step. It's going to involve reading the incoming signals, identifying these shocks, distinguishing between alternative scenarios which have been in discussion, which the policymakers have been talking about, and they're going to help identify model starting points. The next step in the circular process for the modeling is finding ways of handling the policy concerns that the decision makers have identified. Maybe they're already handled within the model structure, maybe they've been handled previously, and maybe they need some satellite model to be able to handle these concerns. But if they're not yet handled, the model structure needs to be adapted to be able to answer the policymakers' questions. Then with all this, we're going to build scenarios. We're going to build scenarios that show the policy paths that would be consistent with the starting points that we've estimated, with the near-term unfolding of the data which we might be able to assume, and with the decision makers' policy concerns. The things that will tell us what policy paths will be needed in such scenarios to achieve the objectives. This will go back to the decision makers. They will process the information, reach their judgments. They will be helped by scenarios, which help them look at the policy risks. And they'll, in the process of having this discussion, to make policy decisions, update their views on what are the most prominent risks that are being faced at the moment, their policy concerns. So back to the beginning for the next round, these newly updated policy concerns will inform the process as it goes through the next cycle in the evolution.
So,
yes,
David, I would just like to commend you, okay, because in most presentations that I've seen over the years and even the decades, we haven't brought in the idea of the circular process. And the great thing about that idea, I think you're talking about an efficient and like a super efficient process, right? Because what if you had constraints, legal constraints that said that this process starts here, and then we have to do this, and then we have to do that. And so I think you are talking about something that you would organize from scratch without any constraints whatsoever, so that the communication flow would be continuous, almost continuous, with the policymakers and the producers of policy analysis, or what do you have
I
in
think
mind?
it's an adaptable concept as to how it would work. I mean, the policymakers in many environments will only have meetings at certain times because they might involve lots of outsiders in the policy committee, which they come together at certain points. So that's going to be relevant to how the process will be organized. The advance notification of when policy decisions are going to be made these days is pretty common. You advertise the points at which decisions will be announced. That will determine how things work. But the point is that policy is not a one-shot game. Policy is a continuous process. You're constantly revisiting what's happening because you're never completely sure about what's happening. Data's going to come in, you're going to process the data, decisions are going to be made, new questions are going to come up. As policymakers make the decisions, they're going to be unsure as to which of the risks they're going to thread a path through the set of risks that they perceive. And they're going to be unsure exactly whether they're threading the right path. Different policymakers will have different views on that. They'll reach a collective judgment, but be ready to look for information which will help them understand where it's going to go next. And so you're back onto this, the next round, which is involving this examining the data again, thinking about what's the questions which have come up, what's become the bigger question now for the modelers to process. So I think it does fit with the constraints I think you're talking about. But let's now think about that same circular process in terms of an evolution from Mark 1 to Mark 2. So Mark 1 is something where we use that circular process to focus on the most relevant story for the current situation, highlighting the most likely path of policy. And this aspect of focusing on something which is like essentially a singular best view, preferred view, most relevant view of the issues being confronted is something which happens when staff take information to the policy committee. When the policy committee has its discussion, they're tending to try and to work towards an agreed most relevant story, an agreed most likely policy path for policy going forward. And that's how they will also present it to the public. In Mark 2, the focus shifts. The focus shifts towards telling stories about the most relevant possibilities, given the current situation, given the key uncertainties. So it's a shift from a singular story to a set of stories which are illuminating or about the risks. The key differences between Mark 1 and Mark 2 is a heightened attention to uncertainty, a heightened attention to policy risks. There's a need for an increased interaction between the people at the various steps of the circular policy making process, because now the people looking at the data analysts are going to be reading the data to help update the evolving risk analysis. The people who are doing modeling are going to be doing it with a focus on illuminating the policy implications of these alternative scenarios. Policy projections become less granular because more time needs to be spent on addressing the core economic dynamics of alternative policy paths, alternative policy risks. And decision makers become less focused on trying to find the agreed singular best path and more focused on a risk assessment. No single scenario is likely to reflect fully the group assessment. And so policy choices are going to be balancing the risks seen by each committee member and seen collectively by the committee. Policy communication at the same time is going to move away from emphasizing a best or an optimal policy path towards describing policy as a risk minimization exercise, minimizing the risks of meeting the objectives that come about because of the alternative possible developments of the economy. Now, why do we want to worry about this? Why do we want to shift from Mark 1 to Mark 2? Because recent history has shown that we've got significant weakness in our understanding of core economic behaviors. We don't have enough knowledge to be able to identify a strongly peaked point in the probability distribution. And that includes several areas where important non-linearities prevent treating uncertainty as like an additive process or something amenable to some kind of a certainty equivalence treatment. Just some of the examples which are relevant here are that the expectations process may be a jump process. The Phillips curve, which we think has been flat, but that might be a totally state contingent feature. Some shocks like COVID make it, I say bipolar here, but I really mean bimodal distributions in terms of their economic implications. Financial stability considerations, the sorts of things which think about financial stability issues of policy at the effective lower bound. They may produce bubble-like behaviors which are going to be very non-linear in their evolution. So it's time for Mark 1 with the apparent certainty that we just tell ourselves we have, which has been knocked about by many recent events. We move away from that apparent certainty towards taking seriously the unknowns in the policy outlook and doing policy as risk analysis. So Doug, back to you, I think.
So you have to give me the screen back.
Yep, I've stopped sharing.
Okay, so thank you for that. I found it very stimulating, especially all the discussion. But so what I want to talk about is a little bit about Mark 2, specifically. Sorry, we put all this animation in and it takes forever to. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about Mark 2, but maybe take a little trip down memory lane back to IFPASS Mark 1, because there's still lots and lots of institutions that haven't gotten up to IFPASS Mark 1. In fact, I think that was the comment by one of the people here that why the heck are we trying to come up with a new term when we haven't finished with IFPASS Mark 1 and so on, right? So just a little history, as David said, IFPASS was this term that was first used in the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. And the idea, just to give you a little background, they worked with a calibrated model. So it wasn't a question of estimating a model and then they learned how to do monetary policy in New Zealand. It was all calibrated. And before that, they tried to estimate an econometric model. And of course, it was a failure because it couldn't answer any question that was related to what they cared about in New Zealand and so on. So the design of that first model was calibrated, like it was in the case of the Czech Republic and so on. So anyway, we've got a lot of discussion and papers about the experiences of the Czech Republic. And I just want to take a little trip down memory lane to the Czech book. And so there was a preface in the Czech book which documented the development of the forecasting and policy analysis system. And these are just some remarks that Governor Tuma expressed in the preface, right? And so if you read, they were very proud of this regime. They felt that before that, the way that they were doing things on the basis of developing pure judgmental forecasts, okay, that they just, weren't addressing the issues of the policymaker. The way they used to describe it to me is that they'd have a meeting with all these specialists trying to tell them what to do. And they'd say, but what if something else were to happen that's in your forecast? And they'd say, well, it took us a month to do this. It'll take another month to do it again, right? And so they realized that they needed to have a macro approach. And it was very challenging, of course, because everyone knows that Czech Republic, like many countries in that part of the world, were undergoing tremendous structural change, including development of financial markets in the very early stages of this stuff. But if you look at language of what he uses in that 2003 preface, it I think is in some ways consistent with the philosophy of what David is advocating right now. But I think David is absolutely right that we have not been implementing this stuff in most central banks in a way that's sort of consistent with that philosophy. So I love the emphasis that David is trying to push us towards, because I think it's absolutely right. And I think COVID has explained that we just can't think of the most likely scenario. That's not the relevant thing. It's much more relevant to think about managing the risks of Delta getting worse, and they're returning back a little ways. We don't have to return all the way back to February and March of last year when global equity prices fell 35%, and there was massive uncertainty and stuff. But if we just moved partway back, that would be a concern. And I think the Fed policies are obviously worried about that. And David's point is that it might be a better way of communicating that and so on, right? So, but anyway, I think there's some things that there's a specific issue that I'm interested in, and just the way they saw it in the very early days, because they had a judgmental forecast. So they had all these people that were producing this forecast, right? And now all of a sudden they have these people that can produce macro scenarios. And the big issue was kind of blending it all together, right? And a lot of the early inflation targeters that went from that judgmental system to then integrating it into a medium-term projection, okay? They obviously they had to figure out how to do this. And so in some cases, like in the Czech Republic, they assumed that the exogenous part of the forecast, in other words, the part that you take from the near-term forecasters, was too long, okay, because the near-term forecasters were assuming that inflation was going to gradually rise to the target, but they didn't ask the right question, which was, how much do I have to adjust my instruments to get inflation to go back to the target? And as a result, they had systematic misses. So my other question for the panel, okay, is how do you combine, or how do you blend the information from people that are trying to do nowcasting and near-term forecasting, and of course, then turning it into a policy problem where you ask, what do my instruments need to be to achieve my objectives? And of course, what if I don't do anything with my instruments and so on? So that's my key question here. Okay, so the way I'm thinking about it is one aspect that is common, I think, in FPASS Mark 1 and FPASS Mark 2 is that we think of these three elements. We think of them a little bit differently, I think, now that we have COVID and so on. But we think of nowcasting and current analysis and where is the economy and those sorts of questions. And then we think about what are the underlying driving forces. So right now, big issue is that under the assumption that we were to return back to normal, so it's not looking that way because of Delta and so on, but under the assumption that we would be returning back to normal, we have trillions of dollars, over $20 trillion that could be spent at some point And this could result in a big excess demand, even more inflation. And of course, that doesn't look very likely. That doesn't look as likely right now that it's happening anytime soon. But at the same time, we have Delta and concerns about Delta. And so if you're a policymaker and you're concerned about those two things, it's kind of hard to divide nowcasting and near-term forecasting into this thing where the nowcasters go away and nowcast and just kind of pass the information to the near-term forecasters, to the medium-term people. It seems like it all has to happen together. And you might say that's effective communication. We need to get the people doing current analysis and nowcasting and people that are doing the medium-term scenarios. We need to get them to understand each other better. We need to get them to talk a common language and think, have what I would describe as a general understanding of all the issues and jobs that everybody else is doing in the institution. It doesn't mean you have to know every detail about what everybody's doing, but they have to know enough to be able to communicate with those people. And the same is true of people doing research. People are doing effective research, presumably would have a general understanding of what's going on in the institution and how they think about numerous issues and so on. And of course, the last thing is the most important thing, and the thing that's more difficult for most institutions, because it's something where you do need the Bob Solo, which is the third element, which is what do you do with your instruments, monetary and fiscal, possibly, to achieve your basic policy objectives. Okay, now this has become much more difficult for inexperienced central banks doing things like unconventional QE, because they'll say, well, we didn't, we haven't done that before. And so we don't have any empirical evidence about how to think about calibrating those instruments or modeling those instruments and so on, right? But that's sort of similar to the early days of inflation targeting in the sense that we didn't have an estimated model when we did inflation targeting in New Zealand or the Czech Republic or any of those things, right? But we also, if I go back to Governor Tuma, he said, well, geez, if you don't give me a model, if you don't write down something as a basis for discussion, okay, he even said, I don't even care if the model's wrong. It's like, I want to start someplace. So maybe he had David's idea about the circular process, that he just needed to enter the circular process to get something going, okay? And so that's how those people thought about it, that there was tremendous amount of uncertainty in the monetary transmission mechanism, but we simply had to write something down, okay, so that we could, we had a frame of reference from which we could improve things over time. Now, what happens if you don't have, well, we like to think about this as the three elements as flour, it should be FLOUR, by the way. Water and the oven produces bread. But obviously, if you're missing the oven, I don't know if you've done this before, but put flour and water together, you just get glue, okay? And that's what happens if you're missing that third element. So these are the pre-Mark I regimes, where they did not design them to ask the question, what do I need to do with my instruments to achieve my objectives? And so this is, when you don't have that last and very important element, because basically the people are suffering maybe from uncertainty paralysis. They feel that they just can't make that leap to be able to write down a view about the transmission mechanism. And under IFPASS Mark I regimes, it's very much a believe us and trust us that inflation is going to be on target. They're characterized in our research as monetary policy regimes with very low levels of transparency. And as the Czechs have said, when they were hit by the effective lower bound and decided to implement this FX intervention strategy, so this was years ago, but they actually said, they use this old saying, hope is not a strategy. So not doing anything, and it was not doing the FX intervention strategy was not really a strategy at all. It was just hoping that good things would happen. they wouldn't have to adjust their instruments. And so that's the kind of basic idea. Now, what does it mean in practice in terms of the types of analytical frameworks and models that we've been working with central banks? But first thing is much more emphasis on the policy implications of uncertainty. And so we're using scenario analysis, and we think of that as, as Olivier Blanchard has described so nicely, as avoiding dark corners, or what as conservative central banker types say, implementing risk management or prudent risk management approaches to monetary policy. The other thing that I think is really, really important, and this is very much linked to the dual mandate and so on, is having a much better delineation between the views about the economy and policy objectives. And so in our work modeling the US, we find loss functions much better for characterizing Fed behavior, and much better at making it consistent with how they talk about doing monetary policy in the US. Reaction functions just don't work anymore. Well, it's questionable whether it worked at all, but at least since the global financial crisis, we've been systematically different than the so-called Taylor rule and so on. Another aspect of it, which is more recent, is what's going on with the inflation process. So models with endogenous policy credibility. So Naafey and Z are going to talk a little bit about that. Unfortunately, because of climate change, if we have increase in the incidence of nasty supply shocks, it can be expected that those kinds of shocks can challenge even the most seasoned inflation targeting countries, simply because they create very difficult policy trade-offs. You have to raise interest rates when unemployment's high, and that's not a fun thing to do. Or in places like India or Pakistan or places like that, where there's a risk that one of those shocks could raise inflation expectations. If one of those shocks was food prices, for example, that's kind of a difficult situation to have to raise interest rates to anchor the system. So obviously financial accelerators, and this is very much related to developing analytical frameworks to support macro prudential policies. And then more recently, so you notice a lot of these things have non-linearities. I mean, virtually everything has non-linearities here. So that's really fundamentally, from a technical modeling perspective, treating these things as what we could describe as mixed complementarity problems. It turns out that we're really good at solving those particular kinds of problems. Actually, Mika might talk a little bit about that. Fiscal monetary policy coordination. So bring back models where you have both monetary and fiscal. And so obviously we need to go from infinite horizon models to things like OLG models. And people like Mika are here, and they can maybe talk about, because he's one of the leading experts on those kinds of models. And then of course, all this stuff is happening in this environment where we have open source software. So we have R, we have Python, and it looks like we're going to get a version of Diner in Julia. So Michel and his colleagues are developing this, what will be, an amazing public good because of this open source software. So the question is, how do we put all this stuff together? And that's a very interesting question. And then the last thing is training programs, and this really goes back to what I was talking about earlier about Bob Solow. We think of Bob Solow as a composite character composed of people that do research, people that do scenario analysis, people that do nowcasting or near-term forecasting, or people that do communications, central bank communications. You think that all of those people have to have a general understanding, a minimum general understanding about what everybody else is doing in the process, so that they can talk to each other efficiently and so on. And so we don't just need to train people, I think, to be specialists, which of course we do, but we also, I think, need to get them to talk to each other better. So my question is to the panelists, what might they have learned in the past where they might have learned it much more efficiently had there been a specific training program that kind of brought them up to speed faster, okay? So let me talk or introduce our two colleagues from the Central Bank of Pakistan. I'm going to refer to them as Naafey and Z. I call Z because I'm linguistically challenged, and I hope he takes it as a term of endearment because I've spent 4 hours every day from 7 o'clock to 11 o'clock in the morning working with these guys, and it's been just an inspirational experience waking up to see this seasoned person and this young person working together, doing all this great thing. So I'll get maybe them to start, and then we'll move to the next.
Okay, so yeah, I'm going to go ahead. First of all, thank you so much, Doug and David, for having us over here, and thank you so much for putting up this amazing presentation. I think it's really important, as we've mentioned, that we talk about IFPASS Mark II and how it's a step up from the existing frameworks that central banks are using. So I think, yeah, really well put by Doug and David. Since Doug touched on human capital and development, and that's basically one of the topics of this seminar, I also wanted to talk about that issue because I've been sort of a beneficiary of these training programs, having recently joined the Central Bank of Pakistan. And I think the reason why I wanted to talk about this issue is because this is something that's relevant for new recruits that have joined a central bank and are maybe interested in helping to build or improve their central bank's analytical framework. Now, the key point that I want to talk about is, the knowledge gaps that exist between graduate school prep and policymaking in central banks, and how this could be eliminated. Because, as Doug said, like one of the features of IFPASS Mark II is, training our professional economists and making sure that everyone is a generalist. And they can communicate with one another and they can understand how the process is being undertaken. So that's basically what I want to spend a few minutes talking about, and then my colleague Z will pick up from there and then talk about things like endogenous policy credibility and how risk assessment should be at the heart of policy making as well. So I'm going to be quoting a lot of things that Doug has taught us during these 4 weeks we've spent with him, because it's been an amazing experience, especially for someone like me who's more new to central banking and to policy making. So please bear with me. So as I mentioned, so Doug has mentioned a lot of times that macro modelers, they don't need to be just specialists, but they need to be generalists as well. So they need to be the jack of all trades. They need to be good in communicating, they need to be good in programming, and they need to have strong economic foundation. So I'm basically going to try to share my journey over the last few months or so, ever since I switched from the US academia into central banking. And maybe, there might be some messages for people who are willing to make a, similar switch, or people who are, looking to, move into central banking and policy making. So when I accepted this position at the Central Bank of Pakistan, I had no prior policy experience and had just been out of school for a year or so. So I always felt that whenever I talked to someone, let's say at the fund or any central bank, there were significant gaps, at least in my understanding, especially because I felt like there was a gap between my PhD training and how things work in the real world. Because when you're estimating econometric models, most of them are backward looking. So to be honest, there's not a whole lot you can actually learn from them, especially for policy purposes. So when I accepted this position initially, I got in touch with the management of the Central Bank of Pakistan, and they were kind enough to share different training resources and materials with me that would help me get up to mark with the IFPASS Mark I. And that essentially, having those resources at my disposal, enabled a very smooth transition from academia into the world of policymaking. And then when I moved back to Pakistan from the US, I spent the first few weeks, and the management of the central bank then encouraged me to look into different training programs. That's basically when I came across Doug's course on IFPASS to support forward-looking monetary policies, and I again was very curious to see how that goes and how a course like that would help someone like me who is a newbie or who's willing to or looking to train themselves and learn more about how to communicate policy messages. How should we think about let's say supply shocks in the case of a country where inflation expectations are not anchored. So over the duration of this course, we discuss various features of the IFPASS Mark II, which includes endogenous policy credibility, which we'll also be discussing in a while, and further how those features could be incorporated into the existing framework that we have right now. So the point that I'm trying to make is that it's very essential to have these training materials and have a knowledge base for professional economists, because it makes the job a whole lot easier in terms of their transition, or in terms of them fitting into their these new roles. So just to highlight how helpful this knowledge base has been. So let's consider an example. So during the course with Doug over these 4 weeks, we looked at different things. We looked at the principles of flexible inflation targeting, as he's outlined in his paper with Friedman from 2009. Now, when I was in grad school, we had studied these principles, but it was just it felt like it was scattered all over the place. There was no one consolidated document or one consolidated thing that could which focused on why should monetary policy play the role of nominal anchor and things like that. But having that consolidated document or having that training material at my disposal essentially has helped me understand what is flexible inflation targeting when I'm designing a framework, or when I'm trying to build a framework at the Central Bank of Pakistan. What are different principles that I need to follow? So that's basically been very enlightening for me. So essentially, my own experiences with these different training materials, whether it was presented to me by the Central Bank of Pakistan first before moving here, or by Doug, it's basically helped me realize the need for training materials and a knowledge base that will help new recruits bridge this knowledge gap between what you're studying in grad school and what's happening in central banks. And again, having this kind of training material essentially allows for the development and sustainability of human capital in central banks. So again, I've had about 4 months at the Central Bank of Pakistan, and I've had the chance to learn lots of things. Some of the key things that I've really I've had the chance to work on is basically, as mentioned by Doug earlier, which my colleague will be talking about in a while as well, is the importance of modeling credibility in the case of emerging market economies, where you have these nasty supply shocks and inflation expectations are not anchored. So, central banks in this case might have to, respond, or they might have to sufficiently and aggressively adjust their instruments, in order to avoid any kind of second order effects on inflation. So that my main point was just to highlight the importance of developing human capital and having different training materials at your disposal, because that essentially makes this evolution, or this transition from IFPASS Mark I to IFPASS Mark II a whole lot easier if you have these kinds of things at your disposal. So yeah, that's all from my end. I will hand this over to Z, and then he can discuss the rest.
Thank you, Naafey. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, so first of all, thanks Doug and David for providing us this forum. And so basically what I would like to add on the top of what the Naafey has already said is about the importance of IFPASS Mark II relative to the Mark I. So I have been working at the IFPASS Mark I at the Central Bank of Pakistan since 2015. So, so over here, I would like to touch upon the two features of the Mark II, which I think is more pertinent these days and also going forward. So first thing is about the feature of risk management. Because as David highlighted, that this feature of Mark II basically accommodate the bipolar view about the state of the economy and the potential shock hitting the economy. So over here, I would like to add that it's not only accommodate bipolar view, but it's also a multipolar view in case of potential shocks related to climate change, as alluded by Doug. So because there are many unknowns about, many known unknown about the climate change shock. And so we can argue that because of these many unknown and known unknown, so our model may be in future going to be, there is a uncertainty about the model as well, structure of the model as well. And then because there are so many unknown regarding the impact of human activity on the climate change, and then in turn the CO2 emission on the back to the real economy and the productivity. So the parameters are also related to those potential future shock are also, there are uncertainty regarding the data as well. And then we also don't know about what kind of shock related to climate change which we are going to basically face. So there is shock uncertainty as well. What we can basically Mark II basically provide us in line with the robust control approach to monetary policy, that we need to based on the probability trees, assign some likelihood values to those all the alternate scenarios. And then this framework is going to help us to minimize the loss over all those possible scenarios regarding the climate change shock. And the COVID-19 shock has also highlighted that we need to accommodate a bipolar view into the policy making. And then the second thing which I would like to touch upon is the modeling, explicitly modeling the imperfect credibility which the most of the emerging economies has basically lived with. So as we know that micro-founded and even the reduced form macro model assumes perfect credibility on the part of the central bank. And so in case of emerging economies, because we know that there are imperfect credibility, and then in order to basically anchor the inflation expectation of economic agent in the face of nasty supply shock, central bank in emerging countries has to basically do more weight lifting in terms of adjusting the adjusting the policy rate so that they can achieve the credence of the nominal anchor. So while so particularly in case of emerging economies, one need to basically model the imperfect credibility specifically in the model. So that's my take on these two issues.
Okay, well, thank you, Z and Naafey, for that. So I think we'll we have I have to stop sharing, or I think we have Armen. Armen, can you share your screen and go next, or?
Yep. Let me do it. Does it work?
It looks wonderful. Time for
Okay.
Mark II. Good.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Doug, I took your word in the beginning that you said we have to have fun today.
Okay.
So
good.
my presentation is structured solely for purpose of having fun. That is a warning that I give you. Okay, on a more serious vein, thanks very much for the invitation. Indeed, a very interesting talk, and the questions that you raised are all very relevant. I'm hoping to avoid any overlaps with you, and to make it as close to the real life as possible. And since I suspected that the most of the talk that David and you, Doug, would cover the advanced economy issues, and you covered the New Zealand, and David covered the process in advanced economies and IFPASS generally very eloquently. What I will do, I'll talk about the successes of IFPASS more from the emerging market perspective. And here, when I talk about monetary policy, I really mean IFPASS, and I use these two interchangeably because I think you cannot really do good monetary policy without having a structured process. And I think if you look at the historical timeline, one of the things which was discussed in the beginning of 2000s is if you can actually do inflation targeting in countries which do not have underdeveloped financial markets. And this was a big issue at that time. And I remember at least a couple of times that this there was a shift in the ideas. And I think one of the key success points, I'll come back to this later on, because this is, until now, there are people who are not agreeing with this, but we can talk about this. But I think one of the key points is that inflation targeting can work in countries which have underdeveloped financial markets. So this is not just a framework for rich club with deep markets, but this can be useful for developing countries as well. So this is number one. Second key success, I think, which is important, and we have countries in here which have highly dollarized economies. I think the second point was, again, there was a big question if inflation targeting and IFPASS can work in dollarized economies. And there as well, the key, one of the initial answers was no. You have too many problems in dollarized economies, no transmission whatsoever, and so you cannot do inflation targeting in a dollarized economy. So I think this is also has been proven wrong, and you can actually do decent inflation targeting in dollarized economies. And I think we have countries on today's call, which actually did that. Third point, which I think is the most important, is the transformation of communication, and both Doug and David talked about this. I think there was a big transformation in communication, monetary policy and IFPASS, because in the beginning, transparency was basically viewed mostly as a headache. You want to avoid things, you want to surprise markets to be more effective. But I think over time, policymakers, and Czech Republic is the perfect example of it. We saw that transparent communication is really a virtue rather than a problem, and it can be very, very useful. And I think this is also a very important shift. So now this is the first part of the question. So what was good? And I think the next question is really, so how we do make monetary policy great again? And what is how do we go about the Mark II and the transformation in the future? And in here, one thing which I use very frequently is really the quote from Henry Royce, who is one of the founders of Rolls-Royce. What he says is, you have to strive for perfection in everything, take the best that exists and make it better. Doesn't exist, create it. So I think we are really at this juncture currently for IFPASS 1, and we have to understand what is really working and what do we need to make it better. I think this is a key point. And so let me give you a list, which some of you will love and some of you will hate. But let me try. The first point is uncertainty. And I think this is pretty obvious for everybody that uncertainty is really the elephant in the room. And you cannot really deal with monetary policy currently without taking care of uncertainty. Most relevant scenarios are not really just marginal variations of the baseline. This is not true. And this bimodal or risk management bimodal basically mode that David was talking about is really relevant, because in many cases when you make decisions, as COVID was a very good example of this, you do not really have this continuous range of scenarios to make decisions, but you really have to have a risk management approach. And we had such a decision to make in December when inflation in Armenia was still below the target significantly, but we saw inflation coming. And there was a very vivid discussion in the board if we have to be aggressive because we saw very significant risks. So we saw a scenario, a possibility, as David mentioned, which is which could turn out very, very badly, okay? But most of the board members wouldn't see it as a baseline. So how do you go about it? So you see there can be a scenario which is a dark corner, as Olivier Blanchard coined it, but really it's not, nobody can think of it as a baseline scenario. So this question, how you go about it, is not really a very easy question to answer if you look at it from the policymaker's point of view. So I think this jump or non-continuous nature of the possibilities is really a big issue for the monetary policy to consider. And you go forward, you think about climate risks. I think that colleagues from the Central Bank of Pakistan talked about climate risks. These are all shocks which do not have a continuous nature. So these are hard to think of, you really need a risk management approach. Second thing, this is really to provoke, is the exchange rate. I can never have any presentation without saying the word exchange rate. That's why I think what is really important with exchange rates is that if you look at the growing literature and the way that the markets work currently, there is an increasingly important role for liquidity driving the exchange rate. So if you look at the theories which are driving exchange rate variations, increasingly there is evidence that liquidity is really very, very important. So it's not only balance sheets and other kind of stuff which have to do with the solvency are important, but really the FX liquidity and the markets are driving the exchange rates. Now, liquidity is probably the most complicated thing to model. So that is why I wrote here that I don't even know if this is possible to do. And but I think this is really a very interesting place to venture. Looking at the exchange rate determination, which is a function of the liquidity shocks, rather than the simpler processes that we think about. So this is really just to provoke. Now, financial stability and macroprudential policy, I think this was also mentioned. So I want to mention it from 2 points of view, which have to be incorporated in IFPASS. Now, if you look at how the macroprudential frameworks evolve now, they all go to this scenario-based analysis. They increasingly go to the scenario-based analysis. If you look at the IFRS 9, all the big banks are now, they have to have their consistent scenarios. And this is, of course, consistent macro scenarios for stress tests. And this is, of course, a big issue. So I think there is a room for convergence for scenario building in monetary policy and financial stability people together. And here again, if you have it goes to the first point, if you have the tail risks in a financial stability and significant scenarios like that, how do you incorporate it in the monetary policy, which really, until up to now, in most of the cases had this baseline scenario mindset. So I think there is a clear way to integrate financial stability and macroprudential policy. There is, of course, a big literature on this, on other aspects of the macro and macropru and the monetary policy interactions. Financial markets, I want to go back here, to this number 1 point here. And I have to say, if you look at the, of course, we see that the inflation targeting works with underdeveloped financial markets. But the question here is, at least in my experience, while working with the central banks, really monetary policy people take these financial markets as exogenous for their work. And there's a big question now if really the progress of monetary policy is in any way hindered or rather is bound by the underdeveloped financial markets, and if the monetary policy has to have more I shouldn't say aggressive, but basically more role in developing financial markets. And I think this is also an interesting question. We certainly see this in Armenia in case of the derivative markets, and this is going back to the second point with the liquidity shocks of exchange rate. We see that like a financial market, like derivative instruments, are really making our work much more complicated. And I think this is also interesting thing. Now, the fifth point, which is from the practical point of view, is very important. And so I think most of the questions, Doug, that you asked 3 questions. How many Bob Solos do we need? You asked the question about the integrating short-term forecasting guys and near-term forecasting guys, and if there are the specific training programs. And I think these are all, in this last point, which are the human resource problem, because I think, human resource problem will be the big problem for IFPASS going forward, because it is increasingly difficult to become as agile as needed, to keep the people in monetary policy, since there are so many possibilities now, which are sort of in a hype. So your 3 questions are, I think, are key. So I think what we need to do here, and this is something which is the vision of the head of our monetary policy department, most of you know him, Haik Avetisyan, is, so I talked about Rolls-Royce. We have to shift from Rolls-Royce to Tesla. And do you know, I have a quick quiz for you. You know what's the difference between the Rolls-Royce and Tesla? So the big, I don't know if anybody has an idea, or everybody's already asleep. But the
everything, everything,
more or less, yes. Because the Tesla is not really a car; it's a software. So it's fundamentally agile. Every morning you have an update on Tesla, and you have a new car. So I think this is the future for monetary policy as well. And this is the answer to all of your 3 questions, Doug, because of course you need everybody to be Bob Solos, and you need to rotate people, as you said, and you cannot have just a near-term forecasting guy or a short-term forecasting guy. They have to be in all the roles and become Bob Solos. Of course, this is easier said than done, and the only way you can do it is to have this sort of the Tesla agile work style, where you rotate people, and they work in all the roles. And then you want to have a this is something which we are going to experiment in the Central Bank of Armenia. So basically this is IFPASS, which is agile IFPASS, and we see how it will go. We don't know, but this is something that we're going to try. I think the in terms of the specific training programs, Doug, and I think this is my own experience. So in developing countries, of course you need training programs, but I think the key aspect is not really the technical stuff. So technical stuff, the modeling is really important. It's always very important, but really the bottleneck is that that people who are doing monetary policy, in order to become Bob Solos, they have to learn how to tell stories rather than tell the collection of details. And this is, in our experience, a very, very hard thing to achieve. And I think, so Doug was my mentor, and we have many colleagues who have mentored me, including Kevin Clinton and others. And I think this is the key that I learned is, it's the power of the stories, and monetary policies is all about the stories. And I think this is the hardest thing to learn. And any training program for developing countries who want to invest in IFPASS Mark II, this is really what they need to do, really to learn how to tell the story. Now, the last part I want to talk about, this is also really like a yellow pages, but again, to provoke some discussion. I think these expectation formation processes are very important, and David talked about these jump expectations being jump processes against having the continuous. And I think this is the recent criticism of the inflation expectations. I have my own opinion is this is displaced. This is not misplaced. I don't think this is a fair criticism, but I think this is gaining lots of traction right now. And I think this is on the top left, you have the quote from Mervyn King. I think he did it just yesterday or a couple of days ago, where he basically says that in a world of radical uncertainty, we cannot be confident that central banks will in fact behave in a way consistent with hitting the inflation target. In such a world, expectations are too fragile to anchor inflation. So this goes against, everything that was that has been said, so far. And I don't think this is the right way to go about. But I think this is something that we have to communicate clearly. And the other thing, which you all probably know, is on the bottom right-hand side, which is the abstract from the from the Fed, the economist from the Fed, Jeremy Rudd, who had this paper which became very famous because there he was saying that one of the most fundamental premises of the framework that they use, basically inflation expectation, is basically bullshit. I'm sorry for but this is really what he has meant. So I think this is also something which has to be addressed in terms of understanding the inflation expectations. No need to say that today everything really is communicated through inflation expectations at this critical juncture. So I would also love to hear your views on this as well. And this is my closing slide, and I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Okay, perfect. And so we have Mika and Shalva left. And so Mika's been around actually at the Bank of Finland. So he's probably one of the most experienced modelers that worked on things like models with fiscal policies and stock flow dimensions and that sort of thing. So, but what are you going to talk about, Mika?
Well, thank you for inviting me here. I have a couple of remarks, but first I need to say that the views I have, they are just mine and do not necessarily represent the views of Bank of Finland, Eurosystem, or ECB. Okay, that said, I think everything you have said is kind of ringing a bell. I mean, I have it easy to understand it, and I kind of relate to those issues. I think from the euro area view point of view, if we think what has been perhaps the most pressing problem, at least for the central bank, has been this sort of a liquidity trap we have been for perhaps last 10 years, extremely low inflation, and the monetary policy has been extremely expansive, and still we are kind of in a trap, looking like the monetary policy is not enough effective. Only very recently, last month, both the headline and the core inflation were kind of stepping up, and we will see how it will kind of what it will end up. But in the end, we are kind of hoping that this new strategy which we have implemented, namely the symmetric 2% target, helps to get out of this liquidity trap. Then if we are seeing this, hopefully we will exit from this kind of loose monetary policy in the long run. And there are a couple of things, these huge debt levels we have, and also the very high asset valuations we are having in bond markets, in stock markets, and also in the housing markets. So you may, of course, say that these are based on the fundamentals, but on the other hand, there are quite many views that these may be priced really high compared to the fundamentals. Regarding your questions about the Bob Solos, I think we need different people. I mean, Bob Solovo is first-class economist, but on your slide you also have Stanley Fischer, who is also extremely good economist, and also he has worked in a different central banks for many years. So this kind of people we need. And then we also need people who really can use models, like, for example, David Reifschneider, who just retired from the Fed, who can make these models sing. Regarding the nowcasting and the policy analysis, I'm not exactly sure how to best do it. Of course, we are using quite a lot of models, so we are using the nowcasting information to kind of fine-tune the initial points, say this quarter and maybe next quarter, when we are then letting the longer run be more determined by the models we are having. And of course, when we are doing this is just a central project, and what you might call the IFPASS Mark 1, but then this is not the only story we have. We also have some kind of imagination what are the possible other scenarios that we might have, and that is kind of super important thing. The best learning program I can think is just learn one model, and then when you have learned it, then try a suite of models. Then you know a lot of economics. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Mika. And so lastly, we have Shalva, who's the head of the research department at the National Bank of Georgia. So thanks, Shalva.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for putting up this great panel discussion. So I just want to emphasize three things. There has been a very interesting discussion. All the presentations and discussions were very useful and quite very important for macro modeling in the policy institutions. And I would just like to add 3 points. So the first point is that I really like the idea of going back to the name of IFPASS from PPASS and framing this as an evolution from Mark 1 to Mark 2, because this essentially underlines that this is an evolution, not a revolution. This doesn't change the philosophy of telling the stories, because the IFPASS was, when it was implemented, was all about telling the stories to policymakers, because this is a point which you have emphasized, I think, in previous presentations, that the forward-looking policy is not forecasting, because you can have a very good forecast, expose that your inflation forecast can be very accurate, but your policy can be wrong because your story that you base your policy on may be wrong. So if you have a forecast based on a black box, that doesn't really mean much anything for right policy making. So that emphasis on forward-lookingness and telling the stories that drives your forecast is the philosophy of even existing IFPASS. And now we're trying to evolve into an IFPASS system, this Mark II, where we still tell stories, but we tell stories about slightly different things, sometimes very different things. For example, we transfer our attention from baseline forecasts to the risks, to some dark corners, as you mentioned, and trying to guard against avoiding these dark corners. So this is I think the part where this evolution is better classified, Mark 1 versus Mark 2, that we're still focusing on telling the stories. It's just that we're trying to tell the stories about things that appear to be more important in this current environment, in this heightened uncertainty environment, trying to avoid these dark corners and telling the stories policymakers that will make sure that they understand these risks. So it's more like a shift from the central forecast, central baseline based policymaking to more risk management approach policymaking. So I think that that is a very welcome development, welcome evolution in the IFPASS. And this brings us to the second point that I want to make, and this is more technical side, which is about how we deal with these nasty non-linearities in our models. For example, Armen mentioned Mervyn King. Actually, I had a look about had a look at this speech from Mervyn King. I think it was an event by Institute of International Monetary Research, and in addition to emphasizing this heightened uncertainty, King also mentioned these two failures of models that may actually be a source of incorrect policymaking. One was that the existing models have no role for money, and the second was that the existing models are based on the assumption of stationarity. I think there are many models now that do incorporate the role for money, for financial frictions, for financial stability, macroprudential policy, and many models today are non-stationary. So I think technically this is probably true only for models before the financial crisis. But there is some truth in it, in that in some sense, currently, many central banks still rely on linear models. So there is some truth in that. The current models are usually focusing on these linear interactions, and at least like this is still the part of the IFPASS Mark 1. So one of the technical sites where this evolution should happen is, I think, switching from this linear approach to non-linear models. But then we face this technical difficulty of dealing with these nasty non-linearities in the model. And this is most important thing when we try to bring our model to data. For example, when we want to filter the existing data based on our model and understand what this model has to say about the historical context. So this historical narrative that was part of IFPASS Mark 1 should also be part of IFPASS Mark 2, but because IFPASS Mark 2 has to incorporate these non-linearities, we're necessarily, we have to deal with this issue of somehow trying to bring these non-linear models to data in an efficient manner. So this is a work stream that is, I think, relatively new. We have tried to contribute this. We have published our one of the technical papers at the Central Bank of Georgia, co-authoring with Doug, and this paper is about somehow trying to come up with technical solution approaches to nonlinear models that can be applied in a filtering sense, trying to filter out unobservable variables in the forecast based on the nonlinear models. So, of course, this work of ours is still in its very early stages, but I think this is the area where we would need to work more on a technical side, because again, we would still need to be focusing on a historical narrative approach to policymaking, and we still we also need to involve some nonlinearity. So this combination of historical analysis and nonlinear models makes it inevitable to have some tool that will help us in filtering the unobservable variables in the forecast based on our nonlinear models. And the third point I want to make is more about the organizational part of IFPASS. The IFPASS Mark 1 was, I think, very rightly so, focusing on how to develop this process, the modeling tools that central banks can use, because this was how it was first developed. But going forward, I think now even more emphasis should be paid to the people that manage these IFPASS and models. So this training part is, I think, the key part. And there was this presentation that you delivered about these the components of the IFPASS, which incorporated something like how you report, how you collect data, how you report it. The nowcasting was also part of IFPASS. Then you had this core QPM model, some scenario risk analysis and monitoring. And this was how the IFPASS Mark 1 was characterized. But I think there is one part missing, and which is the organizational part. Namely, it should be part of the process. It's not just a one-time endeavor that you just train your people and you're done. I think this is part of the process, so that we understand the evolving nature of these factors that affect our economies. And because we live in this in this heightened uncertainty, there could be different kinds of non-linearities, different kinds of dark corners that we may want to avoid. And this calls for economists that understand both how to incorporate this analysis, this uncertainty into existing models, and also how to interpret these results. So this is a continuous process. The training of this stuff is a continuous process, and I think that's a part of even the formal description. That should be part of the formal description of IFPASS Mark II. And actually, you mentioned this when you had this slide, what is new in IFPASS Mark II, and you had, I think, 9 or 8 bullet points, and you had this training at the end of the bullet points. So I think you had Bob Solo at the end, which you should have had it at the beginning. So I think this is the key part of IFPASS, to have economists that understands both how the general economics works, and also how to incorporate this into our models that incorporates these linkages that sometimes we may overlook, but our model just forces us to think about this and to structure our thinking and to make sure that we do not overlook any linkages. So this, I think, answers partly your question of how many Bob Solos we need. And I think from my personal perspective is as much as we can, because I think the supply is constrained. So we are at the binding constraint. So we have this binding constraint and I think we should be trying to have as much Bob Solos as we can. And in terms of the more technical question, which you had about how the process works currently in terms of incorporating nowcasts and near-term forecasts into a more medium-term picture, I think this is a bit challenging to do automatically, because these NTF near-term forecasts are based on a different kind of philosophy than these medium-term forecasts, which are based on this storytelling philosophy. But I think in practice, it makes sense to somehow do the iterative process. For example, you have some near-term forecasts, and when you incorporate this into your medium-term picture, then you discuss this again with your near-term forecast experts. And if this makes sense, and if not, then either they adjust their near-term forecasts, or we change our story and incorporate something that is more in line with the near-term forecast. So I think in practice, this is more like an iterative process where you just go through these cycles of making sure that your NTFs and your medium-term story are consistent. So this was all I wanted to say. And again, thank you very much for this very insightful discussion.
Okay, so that was perfect. We covered, I think, a lot of this stuff. But next week, we're going to have same cast of characters almost. And we'll carry on the conversation. But we're also going to be talking about 2 issues. One specific about uncertainty and macroeconomics, okay, which is a very technical issue when you get into the details of the modeling and so on, because it involves nonlinearities and so on. But we're also going to talk a little bit about how to think about this general training versus training for specialization, using this as an example, for example. So we have Pablo Gueron from Boston College, who's one of the leading experts in this area. And the idea next week is just to get him to explain what this is all about. We've actually put 3 courses together with Pablo from the Better Policy Project. And it starts off with this idea that we want to start off with providing some general knowledge about the subject matter. And so next week, he's going to talk about this first course that we're doing in February that's designed for generalists. So this is maybe somebody inside the institution, chief economists, policymakers, people making decisions about resource allocation, people that just want to understand something about the empirical work on uncertainty and macro and so on. So it'd be nice to like just have a course where they can be introduced to this stuff and to have a feeling for what developments have taken place and what are interesting avenues to pursue and so on. And so that's kind of like what we call the 101 course. Okay, so that could be for generalists or for someone that's an introduction to someone that wants to become more specialized. So the 101 course then turns into a 201 course. And the 201 course is obviously exploiting open source software like Python and R to develop practical measures of uncertainty to explain things like precautionary saving behavior in the United States, for example, but obviously applying it to other countries will be useful. And then there's a even higher level course that gets even more geeky, which is more about getting into solving models with uncertainty and because these nonlinearities, they require fairly specialized human capital to get in and really and do research in that area. So that's the idea. We're also thinking about putting something where people like you can choose what exactly is in that general knowledge set that you would like all your economists and everybody involved in the system to know, right? So it's not like we're going to decide that. We're going to put together a list and you can click off the things that you guys think as institutions are things that you believe everybody in the institution has to know, presumably starting with Naafey's principles about monetary policy, because if we don't accept those, it's pretty hard to imagine that we can contribute to the discussions about monetary policy and so on. So unless there's a burning comment or question, I would suggest that we thank everybody on the panel that participated and then maybe adjourn until next week. But if there's a burning question or comment from the audience, otherwise I think we'll adjourn until next week. But so okay, well,